As I'm doing some slash burning today, I decided I would address some of the questions and comments I got on some of my latest slash burning videos. One of the more common ones is, why do I burn slash to begin with? Why don't I just leave it on the ground for habitat, for nutrient cycling? We'll address that one and maybe some other questions if I can remember what those questions were. Note to self, make notes about what the questions are before doing a video answering questions. The next question is, do I get right to the point and get right into that question, or do I make you watch me do a bunch of other things that are unrelated, then sometime later in the video, eventually get to what the video was supposed to be about? The decisions we have to make as YouTube creators. How about we just get right to the point? If we come over here, here's an example of where I did leave the slash. In a lot of cases, I do leave the slash and I don't burn it. We have all kinds of woody material on the ground. A bunch more of it up here. Then if we go over here, another area where I just left the slash on the ground. Most of it is all low to the ground where it's not a huge fire hazard. I'm more likely to leave the slash in the more heavily wooded, heavily forested areas. Most of this property is heavily wooded, heavily forested. But I have a few places like this where it opens up on the edge of an area that has the type of soil that can support a dense forest. It turns into a more shallow soil, meadowy area where a few pine and scattered white oak do well. In this specific area of the property where I've been doing a lot of the work I've been doing on my recent videos, I want to keep it more of a meadowy, open area. The main reason probably just because it looks nice. It also creates wildlife diversity. When you have a thick forest, a lot of times there's not a whole lot of greenery on the ground for wildlife to eat. At least not in some parts of the year. In some parts of the year, these shady areas do support a little bit of greenery, but not this time of year. There's hardly anything here for the browsers like deer to eat. Whereas if you get into these more open areas, there are all kinds of green things on the ground for deer and other wildlife to eat, especially in the winter and early spring. These white oak with their leaves off let sunlight get to the ground. Do have leaves, they only provide limited shade. So this is a good place to keep it cleaned up and open. This spot where I cut this tree down into this open area, the deer are going to have a hard time getting to the food that's down there. I think deer are probably like the rest of us in the sense that they would rather not have to weave their heads down through a bunch of slash to get to all the good stuff. Have a bunch of sticks poking them in the eyes and poking them up the nose, jamming into their ears. I can't blame them for that. What I have found, if I leave something like this out in one of these open areas where there's a lot of light, that's where things like poison oak and brush start growing up through it. And you end up with a brush patch. Out in the open, the deer are able to eat a lot of those woody shrubs, and they never establish. That's why these places that are grassy like this stay that way. The deer do a good job of keeping the brush down. But if I was to leave a bunch of slash scattered around here, that brush would start taking over this meadowy area. In saying that, I don't mean to say that this is always how brush and poison oak get established, or that the deer will always keep them under control. It's just a tendency I've noticed happening here. In your area, it may be different. That's one of the reasons I plan on burning all this slash, to help maintain this open green area, just for a little diversity in between the thick forest that's all around it. In the thick forest, I can leave the slash on the ground because there's not enough light to support a lot of brush growing up through it. If I spend too much time talking, my fire dies down. Such a good thing to do on a cold morning, have a nice hot fire. You know what I think's been missing on some of my latest videos? I haven't cut any trees down. I think we should at least do one on this video. This little Douglas fir doesn't need to be here. It's just excess. All it's doing is taking resources from the bigger one next to it, this oak and this madrone. And the top of it will land right by the fire so we can take care of the slash right now. Another reason to consider burning the slash instead of just leaving it is wildfire danger, which is a huge problem here on the West Coast. Little patches of slash here and there are less of a concern, but when you have continuous slash where a fire can travel a long distance through it, that is a big concern. Or even a small spot where that can act as ladder fuel to make an intense fire that gets the fire up into the crowns, then you can get a runaway crown fire. When I do leave slash, I like to lop it up fairly close to the ground. That reduces fire hazard. When the slash is close to the ground, it also retains moisture and it rots faster that way. Someone forgot to turn on the camera. This is the edge of the more open area. We're getting into a more wooded area here. I'm just going to leave this log here for woody debris. In a past thinning, I left a lot of this bigger woody debris. They call it coarse woody debris. This larger material doesn't really do much to fuel wildfires. It gives woodpeckers things to eat. If we were to start turning over logs, we'd start finding little critters here and there living under it. After this is all cleaned up, it'll make what we call a fuel break. A place where there's not a whole lot to burn, and it's a good place to stop a wildfire if there was one. I would think it would be a good idea if we were to create more fuel breaks on a lot of our forest scale landscape here in the West, where wildfire is a big problem. On public lands and other lands, they could build fuel breaks in strategic areas like ridge tops, along roads, places where if there was a fire, it would be easy to stop them there. Instead of doing what we do now, which is wait until the fire starts, then all the firefighters scramble out to the woods to try to build a fuel break really quickly around the fire. If we would build them before there was a fire, we could reduce a lot of the expense of firefighting. In some areas they're doing that, but in most of the forest, that's not happening. And I know there are problems associated with that. For one, it'd be very expensive. Who's going to do the work? It's hard to get people to do labor these days. And there would probably be public opposition if we were doing that on public lands. Seems like a nice idea though. At least I can do that on my property. I can have strategic places where a wildfire could be easily stopped if one was to come along. Now I'll get another fire started over here. What is this? I found something. That looks like somebody cut down a tree using an angled back cut, then tried to hide the evidence by throwing it into the bushes. I can't imagine anyone around here doing anything like that. I better get rid of these for good before someone else finds those and thinks that I might have done something like that. After I started thinking about it, this little tree that I cut down was a very pathetic example of cutting a tree down. So let's take out another one. This little suppressed fir is never going to amount to anything. It's just taking resources away from the healthier, bigger trees around it. That one was actually pretty pathetic too for a tree falling video. Now the question is, if you take one pathetic, add another pathetic to it, does that make it less pathetic? Or does that just double the pathetic? Things that make you go, Either way, these trees around it should be happy to have that one gone. They'll make good use out of the water that other one would have been taken out of the ground. The problem with burning wet slash is it can produce a lot of smoke. But that can be limited by how you do it. If you don't smother it too much, it won't do as bad as it will if you smother it too much. But still, it can make a lot of smoke. Around here, there's no one around for it to bother. But if you're in a place where you have neighbors who you might smoke out, it's something to consider. That is, if you're the type of person who is considerate of the people around you. If not, well then no worries. Actually, there probably could be still worries because someone might call someone who could come shut you down because you're producing too much smoke. I did remember a couple other questions I got. One of them, do I have to get permits to do burning like this? Or a permit, not permits. For a lot of people in rural areas here, it's too bright over there. They're supposed to go to their local fire district and get a permit from them. It's easy to do, it's free. But in this case, we don't have a local fire district, or I'm not in a fire district. But in order to run power equipment and do forest operations out in the forest, I'm supposed to get a notification of operation through the Department of Forestry. On that notification, I say I'm going to do burning, and that's good enough for a burn permit. It's the State Department of Forestry who does the fire protection in this area. They also set the fire and burning regulations. Another question I sometimes get is, do I do prescribed burning here? I would like to be able to do more prescribed burning, but to do that safely, it's best to have a crew, which I haven't got into doing, and there's a lot of liability with that if it gets away. I have done a small amount, and usually when I do it, and it's in a place like this, where there's a lot of pine needles or oak needles covering the ground. And I would only do it during times of the year like right now when it's too wet to start a forest fire. But if you get a few days of dry weather, sometimes these needles and oak leaves will dry out to the point where they will burn. And I'll let a fire creep around in the oak and pine needles, knowing when they run out of oak and pine needles, there's nothing to burn that's dry. Everything else is too wet. When conditions get dry enough to where a prescribed burn burns really well, then it's actually getting to where it's dangerous for just one person to be doing it without a crew. I have heard some rumors that there are some possible programs coming out in the state to do prescribed burning. There may even be some upcoming programs where people will come out to your land and use it for practice for doing prescribed burns. And I'm not sure if that's through the Department of Forestry, sanctioned by the Department of Forestry, or what that is. But I'm hoping that turns into something that's useful. That's just rumor though. I probably shouldn't even be saying that because that's how rumors get started. For now, bunch this fire together so we can call it quits for the day. Stay tuned for the next video where I will be saying something about something.